I think a good way to get introduced to development control and how environmental impact assessment happens in Tasmania is to start with the magnificent Environmental Law Handbook. The key part, and I'm just going to scroll really quickly down here and find page 55, is actually, if we have a look at the table of contents, that might help, is under... sorry, they've expanded the table of contents, is under development controls and when you need planning approval, and then from page 55 on is kind of the really juicy part. So I'm just going to scroll down to that and give you a detailed run through of what's in that section. If I can find page 55. 51. Let's actually start at the beginning of this chapter because this whole section is really good, and especially if you're new to planning, haven't done any kind of planning before. This is really the guts of how environmental impact assessment happens in Tasmania as part of the planning process. So hopefully by now you know that there's two really important acts. There's the main Planning Act, which is the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act, and then there's the main Environmental Act that sits as part of the Resource Planning and Management System in Tassie, called EMCA, Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act. So as you might expect, environmental impact assessment is mostly controlled in the Environmental Act, but we have an integrated system in Tasmania. And so the two acts, LUPA and EMCA, as it suggests here, that's what we usually call them, they do work together. And so you need to know how both works. You need to know the planning system, at least roughly in Tasmania, to be able to work as an environmental professional in impact assessment, because that's how the system is regulated. So as we have already talked about, environmental impact assessment is a discussion about future land use. It's about any kind of change or new development on the land, or could actually be an expansion of an existing development. So if you're intensifying land use or changing anything, proposing new infrastructure activities, then you might need approval and you might need environmental impact assessment. Also, as we've already said, there's a few quirks in the system in Tasmania that exempts dams and forestry activities and mining operations, but we'll just skip over that for now. So this week, we're really emphasising that local councils are very important because they are the planning authority when it comes to planning schemes, and this is where everything starts. So you apply to the local planning authority, the local council, local government, for approval to do something. So that might be a pretty modest subdivision with a second house on a big bush block. It might be something much more substantial. So it doesn't matter. In fact, it says here, no matter whether you want to build a garden shed or build a factory or subdivide a rural block, you might well need planning permission. You might well need some kind of an environmental assessment. So the assessment needs to be commensurate with the size of the proposal. So obviously if it's something very small, then the environmental assessment will be pretty small. If it's something like the pulp mill, then it's huge and it takes a long time and it's very expensive. So the development application has to contain a whole lot of clear information about what's being proposed and what the impacts might be. And this is part of the social contract of environmental impact assessment, where we've set up this process so that in this case, the council can look at the information, can share the information with the public and make a decision. And in bold here is the Resource Management and Planning Appeal Tribunal. If at the end stage of this whole process, the developer is unhappy, or the neighbour is unhappy, or somebody who put in a letter of representation is unhappy, they can appeal. Later in semester, we'll talk more specifically about the role of the EPA, the Environment Protection Authority. But for now, we're going to skip through parts of this chapter and try to focus in on local government and how planning schemes are really central to environmental impact assessment. State policies, there's only 3 of them. They're a bit of a Tasmanian quirk. They are important, but yeah, there's only 3 of them. Coastal policy, water quality, and what's the third one listed there? And they are agricultural land, I think. I don't know why it's not here. And so if you want to build on agricultural land, or you have there's something around water quality or coastal policy, then state policies might get triggered. But yeah, really kind of extra complication that you don't need to worry about at the minute. This is all about trying to figure out the simplest cases where it's really just about the planning scheme, learning how to take a development and match it to the planning scheme in order to come up with a recommendation. So this is important in that, and this is really the guts of environmental impact assessment, is that it's matching the receiving environment, as it's called in EIA terms, basically the location that you're putting it and the proposed development, and smushing those 2 things together to figure out whether it's allowed, whether it's completely prohibited, and under no circumstances, unless you change the rules of the planning scheme, can it be given a permit. And then in between, so you'll see the traffic lights here. No way can you put an abattoir in a general residential zone. It's simply not allowed. Go and put it somewhere else. Through to the green light of, well, I want to build an extension on my backyard. I do have to do some minor tree clearing, but everything about the development is part of what's permitted under the planning scheme. So there's really nothing actually anybody can do about it, including people who might not like it. And in the middle is where all of the professional work, most of the professional work of environmental impact assessment happens. And that is this discretionary area where it sits between the 2 extremes. And so that's mostly what we're going to be learning about. So there are development standards for what you can put where, and this is essentially the art of a planner and anybody who's involved with planning schemes. There is quite a lot of detail in this chapter that you don't need, so I'm going to flick past the expansion here on what happens if it's prohibited, what happens if it's permitted. Most of what we'll be talking about is a discretionary use, and that is like it mostly fits, but if it's something in a heritage area, everything is discretionary. So this is designed to give the developer a bit of certainty. So either you can propose something that is allowed, or it's really clear that it's not allowed, and in the middle is where all the fun stuff happens. So this is the process. Council has to take on all of your documentation. So a whole lot of work happens, and various natural values assessments are done, and perhaps Aboriginal heritage. It really depends on what the potential impacts are going to be. Council needs to advertise that if it's a discretionary application. So this means that they have to put it out for comment, and it really depends on how big the application is as to how much time people have to comment. Don't worry about utilities and putting things through water and sewage controls. Another big part of environmental impact assessment is where the potential for environmental harm gets a little bit more serious. In this case, it goes to council, but because it needs expert environmental eyes on it, if it's big, then it goes to the Environmental Protection Authority for assessment. So local councils can only do so much. It's laid out in EMCA, Environmental Management Pollution Control Act, exactly what has to be referred to the EPA. And even if it doesn't quite fit these level 2 activities for something that's particularly controversial or something that somehow the director of the EPA thinks maybe they should take a look at, he has the authority to call it in, as it's called. We'll talk more about the EPA later in semester, but this is an important part of environmental impact assessment in Tasmania to understand. We won't worry about building codes or sewage controls or water. There's a whole lot of detail in here that's to help people who might need this. The EDO handbook, as you might be able to see here, is 240 pages, so there's an awful lot of detail. All right, so this is where we really get started in terms of how the Environmental Management Pollution Control Act works to regulate environmental impact assessment in Tasmania. So there are 3 levels of activities. Most of what we're talking about is level 1. This is where the council is the planning authority and the planning scheme is the control. So activities that have pretty low impact are called level 1 under this act. Local councils are doing the assessing. They do that using the planning scheme. If people are unhappy, they can appeal to the tribunal, but basically it's all pretty straightforward, and not sometimes a lot of environmental work is done as part of this process, but it's something that the council manages. Level 2 is when there's a list of potentially more polluting activities that have potential to cause more environmental harm, things like wastewater treatment plants, wood processing facilities, quarries over a certain size, meat works, things that potentially are going to cause environmental harm. They're all looked at by the EPA. There's only so much that a staff and a council can do, particularly smaller councils. So this goes to the EPA for assessment and a decision, and then council has to abide by what the EPA says that should happen. There's different level of assessments. We'll get to this later in semester. It's not important early on, but to be aware too that there's an even greater level of assessment that's called level 3 under EMCA, and these are also called projects of state significance. We usually use the shortened form because that's what we do in EIA, as we love to call things by the acronyms. So these are POS, projects of state significance. Again, not something for you to really concern yourself with right now. So nearly done. There's just one other thing to be aware of. This was updated in March 2020. It is already a little bit out of date, and this is why printed copies of the EDO handbook are no longer produced, because things change so quickly, and the planning system in Tasmania is changing very quickly at the moment. So there is no longer an environmental management plan. It's called an environmental impact statement, EIS. So that makes our job a little bit easier, EIA, EIS. Yeah, so this is just a tad out of date now. And this cartoon kind of makes fun of that, and that planning and environmental impact use so many different acronyms. So there's a little cartoon here referring to development that's controlled by forestry. RFA is Regional Forest Agreement, EPN's Environmental Protection Notice, blah, blah. Yeah, it's a little overwhelming at first, but you'd be surprised how quickly you get used to it. So environmental impacts assessments actually happen at all levels, but they are called environmental impact statements and environmental impact assessment for bigger developments. It's still environmental impact assessment at level 1. It's just that maybe the reports aren't called an EIS or an EIA. But as you'll see through the examples that we present in this class, it's still environmental impact assessment. And because so much of the work, including, you know, some actually quite large and complicated and contested case studies, are still run through council as level 1 activities, yeah, that's really important. There's a few things at the end of this chapter that you don't need to know that are important in kind of general environmental control, like environmental agreements. But yeah, again, another important section of this chapter, environmental impact assessment needs to look at the likely environmental impacts of the proposal and be open to the possibility that maybe the activity shouldn't go ahead. And this is all done early to try to give some certainty to the developer. If they are putting up something that is not going to be feasible, then they know before they've spent too much money. Yeah, there's a new system, major projects, that gives a very early no, but anyway, look, there's so much detail in here that really not useful for you to know, but we'll talk about it as it comes up over the semester. So environmental impact assessment may not be required for these smaller developments, but it really depends. And as you've probably already got the gist in this unit, if you're in a quite bushy suburb, like you're on a sort of decent sized block in Mount Nelson on the edge of the suburb, abutting up, say, against Bicentennial Park, you might be required to do some kind of environmental impact assessment. It's not necessarily going to be called this, but that's exactly what it is. And, you know, in the case of even quite large developments like the cable car, all the paperwork is all quite similar. The process is pretty much the same as even quite small developments. So, yeah, so the planning scheme is important because so much of EIA work comes through councils, and it's the planning scheme that is the rules where everybody needs to follow, and that's what helps people make a decision. Yeah, level 2 are those things that are bigger, that do require an environmental impact statement, and the EPA sorts that out. Level 3, POS, bigger, hugely expensive, have only been done 5 or 6 times in Tasmania. We used to talk a lot about these really large and complicated projects, but really if we're focusing on jobs and making you job ready and getting used to the process of how this works in Tasmania, it's really not useful to focus on the huge and complicated and unusual case studies. Who conducts the environmental impact assessment? Well, the developer pays for it. If it's a smaller level 2 activity that goes before the EPA, then it's called something different. A reminder here that it's no longer called a DPMP, a Development Proposal Environmental Management Plan. It's called an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement. All of this detail we will come back to in the later part of the semester. So I'm just going to keep scrolling here. The EDO handbook is really important. And so one of the reasons I'm talking you through this is just to be aware that some things have changed even in the 18 months since this has been put out. So you're now preparing environmental impact statements, not EMPs. And yeah, there's a whole lot of detail here that you just don't need to know about. We're going to start with planning schemes and get used to that before we start worrying about some of these bigger developments. So just to finish off this chapter and train of thought, remember that one of the key actors is what we call the tribunal, or RMPAT, Resource Management Planning Appeal Tribunal. So like Shane Warne here, famous Australian cricketer, you can appeal to this umpire, referee, the tribunal, if you're unhappy. Yeah, a whole lot of detail about the tribunal. Again, we used to have a lot of emphasis on the tribunal in this unit, but it's really not useful for preparing you for early work as a graduate. You would generally be shielded by somebody more senior than you if a case that you're involved with went to the tribunal. And yeah, it's interesting, and we will mention it from time to time, but not something to emphasize. All right, there is a little bit more in this chapter, but again, it's something that really falls a bit outside the scope of this unit. We do need to put some bounds on it because there is a lot of to talk about, and yeah, there are 240 pages in this document that we could spend a long time, the whole year, going over all the various parts of environmental auditing and environmental management systems, but we will focus on environmental impact assessment. We will focus on planning schemes to get you job ready. And yeah, so I hope this has helped and that helps you get started with a planning scheme in the context of a planning scheme.